Hello world, welcome to part 3 of the series on the truth about psychiatry. We've already done, my name is John Hancock, and this is, we've already done 2 parts to this series. The first was called Cracked, based on this book behind me here, which was my introduction to the truth about psychiatry. And then last time we did a session on introducing Robert Whitaker through what I titled The Secret of Nim. So that was video 2. And in this third video, I'd like to delve a little more deeply into Robert Whitaker's writings, and specifically his book, Anatomy of an Epidemic. So, Robert Whitaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, shown here, with a provocative subtitle as well, Magic Bullets, Psychiatric Drugs, and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness in America. So a few things that we're going to discuss today will be drawn from this book by Robert Whitaker, and specifically he talks about basically he poses the very questions that I was posing to myself before I discovered Robert Whitaker, and he delves into the history of psychiatry, and he shows how the rise of different kinds of psychotropic drugs, and basically he shows us how psychiatry, that has for a long time claimed to be the solution to the problems of quote-unquote mental illness in the world, actually has been one of the major contributing causes. But we'll get more into that later. But maybe to start off, just like to read a few things from Robert Whitaker's introduction to this excellent book that I highly recommend, especially if you're interested in these questions of, mental illness and psychiatry. And as one friend pointed out in her comments on one of my last videos, this is going to become an increasingly relevant topic, considering the coronavirus lockdown and the quarantining, because there are a lot of people who are supposing that the quarantine will be causing this rise in mental illness. It's an interesting theory, but we'll examine that more in coming videos. So Robert Whitaker, who is Robert Whitaker? He is an investigative journalist, a writer. I have a little more information on him here. Wikipedia, he's a journalist and author, writing primarily about medicine, science, and history. He's the author of 5 books. He wrote for the Boston Globe, and he was on the list for a Pulitzer Prize. He founded and published the website Mad in America that I mentioned in our last session, our last video, and he was also a medical writer at Albany Times Union in Albany, New York. He became the director of publications at Harvard Medical School, and he co-founded a publishing company called Center Watch. So one of his early articles in USA Today was titled "Mind Drugs May Hinder Recovery," and um, and then another, "The Case Against Antipsychotic Drugs: A 50-Year Record of Doing More Harm Than Good." And then in 2005, he published a paper called "Anatomy of an Epidemic: Psychiatric Drugs and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness in America," which obviously was the seedling to his book, uh, Anatomy of an Epidemic, that was published in 2010. So that's a little bit of background on Robert Whitaker, who he is, um, and how he got interested in this topic. One thing that I like to mention is he, at the beginning of his book, in the introduction, he says, it may seem like someone who's interested in this topic came to it, because of personal experience, but that wasn't the case with Robert Whitaker. He was actually researching other things. And then he says, in 1998, I stumbled upon a story that told of the abuse of psychiatric patients in research settings. This is while he was working with Center Watch, and this led him on a quest to find out more. So he says at the conclusion of his foreword, he says, "Since psychiatry is such a controversial topic, I think it is important that readers understand that I began this long intellectual journey as a believer in the conventional wisdom. I believe that psychiatric researchers were discovering the biological causes of mental illnesses, and that this knowledge had led to the development of a new generation of psychiatric drugs that helped balance brain chemistry. These medications were like insulin for diabetes. I believe that to be true because that is what I had been told by psychiatrists while writing for newspapers. But then I stumbled upon the Harvard study and the WHO findings, and that set me off on an intellectual quest that ultimately grew into this book, Anatomy of an Epidemic." So that's how he started off. And Robert Whitaker is a great researcher and a great writer, because he was on the quest for truth, and let pretty much the truth lead the way for whatever answers he would find in science and history, and he pursued that path, and found, and his discoveries were life-changing for me, because it opened up a new world, kind of like James Davies did, of understanding of history and science, things that are mostly remain hidden from the general public. So this is the puzzle that Robert Whitaker begins with. He wants to know, he asks the question, if we have treatments that effectively address mental disorders, why has mental illness become an ever greater health problem in the United States? It's a very simple question, and, basically, if we're such an advanced society with, medicine and psychiatry are advancing and creating these amazing new cures, why is it then that it seems to be having the opposite effect? If these cures and these remedies are so effective, then why the skyrocketing, the exponential increase in so-called mental illness? So that's a good question that he starts with, and he also shows that he has a lot of statistics and a lot of historical um, historical notes in his book, but it's very readable and it's very accessible. Um, I wanna go through it a bit at a time and maybe pull out some important quotations, things that we can talk about, and things that will be important later on in this series of videos. Um, so let's see, what do I have here? So so Whitaker starts off also with some quotes from you know patients of psychiatry who have told their stories of suffering and things that they've gone through, and he wants to know, like, if these cures are so effective, why why is why this increase in mental illness? Not only the increase, but why are all these people saying how awful their experience has been? Wouldn't you expect, if treatments are effective, you would expect for patients to be really happy about the results. Um, but as Whitaker shows, that's not the case for the vast majority of people. Um, so he talks a little bit about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Um, he wants to know what is fueling the epidemic of mental illness. Um, Whitaker goes into the history of psychiatry in a lot of detail, and there are some important things to note in that history. Um, but let me see. I'm just seeing if there's any quotes that would be from these patients that would be useful. Um, some of these patients were wondering about the so-called treatment they received and whether that was actually causing their the problems that they were experiencing. Um, so that's kind of a introductory chapter. So yeah, Whitaker's raising all these questions about the drugs and what the usefulness of these drugs is. Um, in chapter 3, called "The Roots of an Epidemic," um, Whitaker mentions the German scientist Paul Ehrlich, who was influential in developing certain kinds of drugs that now came to be known as magic bullets. So basically, a magic bullet would be a drug that could pretty much solve whatever medical problem was there. And Whitaker ties this into the rise in psychotropic drugs that is now he ties that into how psychotropic drugs have grown so much in the past several decades, because people suppose that they were the the magic bullets of psychiatry to solve the problem of mental illness. So yeah, he has a chapter on psychiatry's magic bullets. Talks a lot about Eli Lilly and different pharmaceutical companies, Thorazine, just chlorpromazine, different early drugs that were developed by pharmaceutical companies to support psychiatry and under the supposition that the the drugs were a magic bullet to cure mental illness. Um, Whitaker tells a story of a guy named Igaz Moniz, who was the inventor of lobotomy. And if you're interested in a pretty gruesome story, I would recommend you read this book and learn about this guy and how he came up with lobotomies. And he was actually a Nobel Prize winner. So, and it was claimed that lobotomies would actually pluck madness from the mind. So, just an interesting story in the early history of psychiatry. So, other drugs were Miltown, Librium, Marcilid. You probably heard of Valium. Those are some of the early drugs. But Whitaker mentions that none of these drugs had been developed after scientists had identified any disease process or brain abnormality that might have been causing these symptoms. So in other words, before there was any recognizable biological problem, the drugs were made as a solution and marketed as a solution without actually fully understanding what the problem was. And as we go forward in future videos, I want to talk more about the so-called problem of mental illness. And Whitaker will introduce another writer that will be important for a conversation going forward, a guy named Thomas Saz. So, what else here? Whitaker points out that one of the reasons psychiatrists or psychiatry was excited about these new drugs is because it would kind of bolster their reputation as being real doctors. So in order to become a real doctor, you had to be able to prescribe medications. And this, the introduction of these new drugs was, helpful for the industry in that way. Whitaker says, all of these drugs were apparently antidotes to specific disorders, and in that sense they deserve to be compared to antibiotics. They were disease-fighting agents rather than mere tonics. All that was missing from this story of magic bullet medicine was an understanding of the biology of mental disorders. But with the drugs reconceived in this way, once researchers came to understand how the drugs affected the brain, they developed two hypotheses that, at least in theory, filled this gap. So first, the assumption was that there's this problem called mental illness. Then drugs were developed that were supposedly developed without any known biological cause for these mental illnesses. And then afterward, theories were developed about how these drugs worked. So think of the order of that and what kind of science that is. So the two theories that Whitaker was talking about have to do with what is commonly referred to as the chemical imbalance in the brain. And you probably heard that before, and if you know people or have friends or family members who struggle with mental illness, you may have heard talk of a chemical imbalance in the brain. I recall, an activity, it was actually a church activity, and for some reason, one of the members of our congregation was giving a presentation. He happened to be a doctor, and he was drawing up on the board the human brain with all these, here's the neurotransmitters, and here's the synapses, and this is what happens. And when you have mental illness, there's this chemical imbalance in the brain, and what the you know the medications do is it corrects this chemical imbalance in the brain. So you may have heard that, and you may know people who take these medications and who under the belief that they're correcting a chemical imbalance in the brain. Well, as Whitaker shows, that's just simply not true. The two theories have to do with one with depression and one with schizophrenia, and they're connected to different neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. And Whitaker goes into great detail of how what these theories were and how what the mechanism of these drugs is. But one of the first people to come up with these theories was a guy named Joseph Schildkraut in 1965, and he was working for NIM, the National Institute for Mental Health, that we discussed in our previous video about the secret of NIM. So he worked for this Schildkraut fellow, worked for NIM, and he set forth the chemical imbalance theory of mental illness. But even he, Schildkraut himself, didn't think it was a very good theory. This is what he said, quote, "At best," he thought the hypothesis, "at best, a reductionistic oversimplification of a very complex biological state." So this is coming from the guy who came up with the hypothesis. And in the wake of this hypothesis was then developed the second hypothesis, the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia, which, as Whitaker points out, is also bunk. So here we have, a supposed problem of mental illness, a supposed solution of magic bullet drugs, then supposed theories or hypotheses to back up the marketing of these drugs, and then the very people who created these hypotheses and theories are actually admitting that they were wrong. So let's see, what does Whitaker have to say about this? So he says, psychiatric drugs had been developed that were antidotes to biological disorders, and researchers believed that drugs worked by countering chemical imbalances in the brain. The horrible mental hospitals that had so shamed the nation at the end of World War II could now be shuttered as schizophrenics, thanks to the new drugs, could be treated in the community. So in the scientific community and the psychiatric community, people believe that the new drugs were kind of the breakthrough that would, lead to the liberation of mental patients from these horrible mental hospitals. But it turns out that actually the opposite was true. And, throughout the book, Whitaker shows how these drugs have actually contributed to the astronomical rise in so-called diagnoses of so-called mental illness. So after the drugs were created and these hypotheses, the next order of business for psychiatry was to actually find these chemical imbalances. So once you have the hypothesis, you kind of want to find out if it's true. So Whitaker has a whole chapter called "The Hunt for Chemical Imbalances." And I think Whitaker would agree with me that this is going to be it will be a fruitless hunt, because you're never going to find uh, these chemical imbalances in the brain that never existed in the first place, and that the very people who invented these ideas already, basically um, basically deny that they're actually viable. So yeah, the two hypotheses then were low serotonin hypothesis of depression and the high dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia. Um, but generally, the narrative was that mental illness in general is caused by chemical imbalances in the brain, and this is something that pharmaceutical companies ran with, and very effectively were able to market. So much so that the vast majority of people still believe that's an actual that this is what's actually going on. That a chemical imbalance in the brain is what is causing the mental illness. Um, so, but as Whitaker says, the medicine clearly doesn't fix a chemical imbalance in the brain. Instead, it does precisely the opposite. Prior to being medicated, a depressed person has no known chemical imbalance. Fluoxetine, which is, I believe that's Paxil, or was that, no, Paxil's paroxetine. Fluoxetine is Prozac. So he talks about, Prozac was one of the early, I guess, second generation drugs. He says Prozac then gums up the normal removal of serotonin from the synapse, and that triggers a cascade of changes. And several weeks later, this serotonergic pathway is operating in a decidedly abnormal manner. The presynaptic neuron is putting out more serotonin than usual. Its serotonin reuptake channels are blocked by the drug. The system's feedback loop is partially disabled. The postsynaptic neurons are desensitized to serotonin. Mechanically speaking, the serotonergic system is now rather mucked up. So here we have a supposed problem with a hypothesis and a magic bullet drug as a supposed solution that is actually creating the very problem that it was, that it allegedly cures. So yeah, Whitaker talks a lot about the effects of the drugs, and the question he asks is, do these drugs help or harm patients over the long term? What do 50 years of outcomes research show? So this is a good question, because a lot of the research that was done was over a very short period of time, saying, oh, these drugs are helping these patients to recover from their mental illness. But what Whitaker is showing is very few, if any, studies were done to consider what the long-term effects of these drugs would be. This is a great book because he goes deeper into the history of psychiatry. We're introduced to the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, the Swiss psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler, who coined the term schizophrenia, and a variety of other early psychiatrists. Let's see, he talks about Thorazine. So, I mean, I would like for you to read this book for yourself, because it's so well written and it's so detailed. But I'm just trying to pick out some highlights that will be maybe whet your appetite. Another thing that Whitaker points out is, once these drugs are given to patients, that there are other problems that arise. He says, in short, initial exposure to neuroleptics put patients onto a path where they would likely need the drugs for life. Yet, and this was the second haunting aspect of this story of medicine, staying on the drugs regularly led to a bad end. Over time, a couple of researchers, Chinoir and Jones, noted that dopaminergic pathways tended to become permanently dysfunctional. They became irreversibly stuck in a hyperactive state as soon as a patient's tongue was slipping rhythmically in and out of his mouth, tardive dyskinesia, and psychotic symptoms were worsening, tardive psychosis. Doctors would then need to prescribe higher doses of antipsychotics to tamp down those tardive symptoms. The most efficacious treatment is the causative agent itself, the neuroleptic, Chinoir and Jones said. So this, basically Whitaker is pointing out, and it makes sense. Once you give someone a drug, that drug is doing something to the brain, and it's causing the person who's taking the drug to become more and more dependent upon it. So let's see. Whitaker's research reveals that these drugs are actually damaging the brain, causing shrinkage in the frontal lobe and, prefrontal cortex, basal ganglia, like all sorts of atrophy, all sorts of problems that are being created by these drugs that were allegedly the solution to the problem. So he has some personal stories from people who withdrew from drugs and how difficult that was. He has a whole chapter on benzodiazepines, which is another form of psychotropic drug, some of which are known as maybe there's Valium, there's Xanax. These are some of the early drugs. And Whitaker notes that these drugs also create all sorts of terrible problems like insomnia, seizures, tremors, headaches, blurred vision, ringing in the ears, extreme sensitivity to noise, a feeling that insects were crawling over them, nightmares, hallucinations, extreme depression, depersonalization, derealization, like a sense that the external world is unreal. So, really awful effects of these drugs. So, let's see. Talks about depression here. And he has a lot of detailed research on antidepressants, what they are, how they work, what they do. The SSRIs, the MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. He's very thorough in his research of what these chemicals are and how and what effects they have on the brain. Read about that. Read about antidepressants and how people become dependent upon them. So this is an interesting passage about depression. In the short span of 40 years, depression had been utterly transformed. Prior to the arrival of the drugs, it had been a fairly rare disorder, and outcomes generally were good. Patients and their families could be reassured that it was unlikely that the emotional problem would turn chronic. It just took time, 6 to 12 months or so, for the patient to recover. Today, the NIM, National Institute of Mental Health, informs the public that depressive disorders afflict 1 in 10 Americans every year, that depression is appearing earlier in life than it did in the past, and that the long-term outlook for those it strikes is glum. So, as Whitaker points out, basically NIM is lying. They're coming up with all sorts of ridiculous statistics to try to, you know, really it's to bolster their own paradigm of of what mental illness is and what depression is. You know, and these are still things you see in the news all the time. Like you'll hear, 1 in 10 this, or 1 in 5 people suffer with mental illness, and you know, 50% of this, and depression this. It's like, no, none of this is even remotely accurate. What depression used to be, or how it was understood formerly, and also in less developed countries, third world countries sometimes, is that people who had so-called depression or schizophrenia, often these people would just recover after a few weeks or a few months. Whereas what Whitaker notices, well, in the United States, the people who are given these treatments are told they're going to be, they're basically, you're going to be depressed all your life. You need to take these drugs all of your life. You're going to have schizophrenia all of your life, and you're going to be thrown in a mental institution and all of these things. Whereas that's only in America, and only when people are given these magic bullet drugs that are supposedly that are supposed to help them. Let's see, more about antidepressants. And I'll talk about antidepressants in other videos, because the word antidepressant itself is misleading, because as we see from the invention of these drugs in the first place, they're not really anti-anything. They were created before the problem was even understood. But then they were marketed under the hoax of the chemical imbalance. Then Whitaker has a whole chapter on bipolar disorder and ADHD, which is very interesting. A guy named Joseph Biederman was one of the main popularizers of these supposed mental illnesses, bipolar disorder and ADHD. So, and Whitaker is showing, like, before Biederman, it was relatively rare that anyone would be, diagnosed with bipolar disorder or ADHD. But after Biederman, these diagnoses are skyrocketing. Whitaker tells a story about lithium and how that was developed. It's really awful. I want to actually share a little bit about this, because lithium was, when you think of lithium, what do you think of? When I think of lithium, I think of batteries. I don't think of something that you want to ingest or take into your body. But somehow, and I'll share the story of how this happened, people began to believe that lithium was also a cure, or a way of managing so-called bipolar disorder. So the way it started with is a guy named John Cade. He was a physician in Australia, and he fed lithium to guinea pigs, and he observed that giving lithium to guinea pigs made them very passive and docile. And so he thought, if this works on guinea pigs, why don't we try it on, mentally ill people and see if that helps them? So in 1949, he reported that he had successfully treated 10 manic patients with lithium. However, he neglected to mention in his published article that the treatment killed one person and made 2 others severely ill. As makers of lithium tonics had long known, lithium can be toxic even in fairly small doses. Both intellectual function and motor movement may be impaired, and if too high a dose is given, a person may lapse into coma and die. So here's a guy giving lithium to human beings, killing them, and then claiming that this is a cure for bipolar disorder. And to this very day, people who have been diagnosed with, or actually, we'll talk about why the word diagnose is wrong, but people who are labeled as bipolar are given lithium as a cure, even though it actually killed people who took it. So there's much more on the rise of bipolar and the rise of ADHD, and that was a very eye-opening chapter to read. Chapter 10 is an epidemic explained. So Robert Whitaker is getting will explain more why we have this epidemic in mental illness. He says, now there may be a number of social factors contributing to the epidemic. Our society may be organized in a way today that leads to a great degree of stress and emotional turmoil. For instance, we may lack the close-knit neighborhoods that help people stay well. Relationships are the foundation of human happiness, or so it seems, and as Robert Putnam wrote in 2000, we spend too much time bowling alone. We may also watch too much television, get too little exercise, a combination that is known to be a prescription for becoming depressed. The food we eat, more processed foods and so on, might be playing a role too. And the common use of illicit drugs, marijuana, cocaine, hallucinogens, has clearly contributed to the epidemic. Finally, once a person goes on SSI or SSDI, there is a tremendous financial disincentive to return to work. People on disability call it an entitlement trap. Unless they can get a job that pays health insurance, they will lose that safety net if they go back to work. And once they start working, they may lose their rent subsidy too. But setting aside those reasons, Whitaker wants to focus on the role that psychiatry plays directly in causing this epidemic. Yeah, the next chapter is about how the epidemic has spread to children. And Whitaker is careful to use, he wants to examine this in the most dispassionate and objective manner as possible. But it is startling how many children have been diagnosed or labeled as ADHD or bipolar, or any number of labels that come from the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. So at the time of the writing of this book, 3.5 million American children take a stimulant for ADHD. 3.5 million, so that number is certainly higher now. Talks about the effects of these stimulants, Ritalin, Adderall, these kind of drugs. So, let's see. So, basically, what Whitaker was finding is a lot of this epidemic is iatrogenic in kind, meaning iatrogenic, meaning caused by medically induced harm. And yeah, my notes in this book, there's lots of kind of exclamations and a few expletives as I'm reading through this and discovering for the first time what psychiatry is doing to innocent little children. is just really horrible. Um, so, Whitaker asks, why does our society believe that a psychopharmacological revolution has taken place during the past 50 years when the scientific literature so clearly shows that the revolution failed to materialize? Or to put it another way, what is the source of our remarkable societal delusion? And I like how he puts that because really, psychiatry has managed to fool almost the entire world. They've managed to deceive almost everyone, myself included. Like Whitaker, I believe the whole, you know, whenever I heard of mental illness or psychiatry, I just automatically assumed that, mental illness is a real thing, and psychiatry, these are real doctors who prescribe real medications that help these people. Um, Little did I know that there's a whole history behind these drugs and a whole history behind psychiatry itself. Um, but Whitaker was asking the right questions. So, toward the end of the book, Whitaker introduces someone. I guess we've talked about him a little bit, but a man named Thomas Szasz. And I'd like to read the passage from Anatomy of an Epidemic on page 264, because really Thomas Szasz understood all of this long, long before Whitaker or anyone else, and he was already writing about these things decades earlier. What Whitaker says about Szasz, the first problem that had arisen for psychiatry was an intellectual challenge to its legitimacy. An attack launched in 1961 by Thomas Szasz, a psychiatrist at the State University of New York in Syracuse. In his book, The Myth of Mental Illness, he argued that psychiatric disorders weren't medical in kind, but rather labels applied to people who struggled with problems in living, or simply behaved in socially deviant ways. Psychiatrists, he said, had more in common with ministers and police than they did with physicians. Szasz's criticism rattled the field, since even mainstream publications like The Atlantic and Science found his argument to be both cogent and important. The latter concluding that his treatise was enormously courageous and highly informative, bold and often brilliant. As Szasz's later told the New York Times, quote, in smoke-filled rooms, time and time again, I've heard the view that Szasz's has killed psychiatry. I hope so, unquote. So Whitaker points out that Szasz's is one of the founders of the anti-psychiatry movement. There were others that were influential, people such as Michel Foucault, R.D. Laing, David Cooper, Irving Goffman, and we will discuss some of these people in future videos, some of their writings. And because of Szasz's and others, it became increasingly clear that mental hospitals were not actually hospitals; they're more like prisons, and they weren't really about healing. They were about social control, controlling what was considered to be deviant behavior. And let's see. There's a lot more that we could talk about in this book. Gets deeper into... Oh, it is important to note, though, that a lot of people have tried to discredit Szasz's because of his affiliation with Scientology, which actually is not as clear-cut as people often assume. So, basically... And Whitaker explains what happened here. He says, but fortunately for the proponents of biological psychiatry, criticism of the medical model and of psychiatric drugs became associated in the public mind with Scientology. Um, so L. Ron Hubbard was, a huckster, but um, Thomas Szasz founded the Citizens Commission on Human Rights in 1969, and that was there was some connection there with L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology. And I want to be clear about this because there's so many people that dismiss Szasz because they claim that he was a Scientologist, which it's not true. And actually, even though there are Scientologists that also oppose psychiatry, Thomas Szasz' criticism of psychiatry is completely separate from Scientology. So whenever anyone tries to claim that Szasz was, he was just a Scientologist, or his criticism is invalid because Scientologists also oppose psychiatry, they're just trying to dismiss Szasz's arguments by, guilty by association with Scientology. And Whitaker says, indeed, it is easy to imagine the drug companies deciding to secretly fund Scientology's protests, eager as they were to shove money to any organization that would wittingly or unwittingly advance their cause. So here we have pharmaceutical companies, the American Psychiatric Association, the National Institute of Mental Health, and also another organization called NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I believe that's what it stands for. So we have all these bureaucratic organizations developing around these, disproven hypotheses of mental illness, but they're all reinforcing the narrative of the chemical imbalance and, reinforcing the psychiatric narrative and, promoting the pharmaceutical company remedies or supposed remedies to mental illness. Right, so Whitaker says, thanks to Scientology, the powers that be in psychiatry had the perfect storytelling foil, for they could now publicly dismiss criticism of the medical model and psychiatric drugs with a wave of the hand, deriding it as nonsense that arose from people who were members of a deeply unpopular cult, rather than criticism that arose from their own research. As such, the presence of Scientology in the storytelling mix served to taint all criticism of the medical model and psychiatric drugs, no matter what its source. So that's just to warn you ahead of time, if anyone tries to claim that anti-psychiatry is connected to Scientology, that that's just false. Whitaker talks about Peter Breggin, another author we'll have occasion to visit, and how psychiatry silences dissent and criticism. I want to this is a good passage. Whitaker says, there is a story that psychiatry doesn't dare tell, which shows that our societal delusion about the benefits of psychiatric drugs isn't entirely an innocent one. In order to sell our society on the soundness of this form of cure, psychiatry has to grossly exaggerate the value of its new drugs, silence critics, and keep the story of poor long-term outcomes hidden. That is a willful, conscious process, and the very fact that psychiatry has had to employ such storytelling methods reveals a great deal about the merits of this paradigm of care, much more than a single study ever could. So we're starting to see the truth about psychiatry, that the chemical imbalance hypothesis of mental illness is false, and that these magic bullet drugs are actually causing the very problems that they're supposed to cure. And what's behind all of this is a vast amount of wealth. Um, there are pharmaceutical companies that are growing filthy rich through the sale of drugs and marketing of their supposed magic bullets. Um, it's at the time of this writing is a $40 billion market for psychiatric drugs. I'm sure it's much more now. Um, and Joseph Biederman was influential in building up this pharmaceutical company market. Um, but it's also important to remember that it's not just psychiatry or the pharmaceutical companies that are benefiting from this, and it's not just the patients that are, it's not just their money that's being sucked out of their pockets. It's everyone because the United States in 2008 spent about $170 billion on mental health services. And it was projected that it would be 280 billion in 2015. So I'm sure it's some, ridiculously high, what's the movie? Uh, Ludicrous. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Like, if you've ever seen the movie Spaceballs, where it's light speed and then it's ludicrous speed. Some ludicrous amount of money is being spent on mental health and psychiatry, psychotropic drugs. It's a great business. It's a great business model because you find a problem in society, or you create a problem in society, and then you find the supposed solution that everyone needs, and then you get all these organizations behind you, including government. And I mean, 280 billion, or how many ludicrous billions of dollars are being spent on mental health? It's just mind-boggling. Um, so, and Whitaker shows in his book Anatomy of Epidemic that this false story that psychiatry has told the public, and that pharmaceutical companies have helped to sell, is actually exacerbating whatever problems people were having, before. Um, so that's a lot of money, a lot of damage, and so in the last chapter, Whitaker, goes into solutions, what he thinks should be done about it. He mentions a guy named Jim Gottstein, who was a Harvard Law School graduate, and he started a company called Psych Rights. Let's see if there's anything from the conclusion that I should share. Whitaker says, for the past 25 years, the psychiatric establishment has told us a false story. It told us that schizophrenia, depression, and bipolar illness are known to be brain diseases, even though, as the Mind Freedom Hunger Strike revealed, it can't direct us to any scientific studies that document this claim. It told us that psychiatric medications fix chemical imbalances in the brain, even though decades of research failed to find this to be so. It told us that Prozac and other second-generation psychotropics were much better and safer than first-generation drugs, even though the clinical studies have shown no such thing. Most important of all, the psychiatric establishment failed to tell us that drugs worsen long-term outcomes. If psychiatry had been honest with us, the epidemic could have been curbed long ago. 4 million American adults under 65 years old are on SSI or SSDI today because they're disabled by mental illness. Some 250 children and adolescents are added to the SSI rolls daily, and I'm sure these numbers have increased since then. So there's a little epilogue. asking basically, here's what I found in answer to my question, why, if we've got such great advancements in medicine and psychiatry, then why in the last, several decades have we seen this enormous rise in mental illness? So, highly recommend Anatomy of an Epidemic, along with all of Robert Whitaker's books, including his book right after that, Psychiatry Under the Influence, Institutional Corruption, Social Injury, and Prescriptions for Reform. This is also a very well written, very well researched book that I would highly recommend. The basic argument being, psychiatry exists to further its own interests at the expense of patients, and just the evidence that Whitaker provides is so persuasive and convincing that he's been very helpful in bringing to light the truth about psychiatry. So that should be enough for part 3, the Anatomy of an Epidemic. So yeah, now we've done Cracked, we've done Mad in America, Anatomy of an Epidemic, and we're starting to understand a little bit more about the chemical imbalance hoax and the harmful nature of these psychotropic drugs, how psychiatry and pharmaceutical companies are profiting from the harm that they're causing. And now we're also learned a little bit more about Thomas Szasz, and perhaps in the next videos we'll talk more about Thomas Szasz. But for now, if you have any questions or comments, please post them below, and I'd be happy to respond. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.